My name is Timmy Lundin. I'm a CG supervisor at Important Looking Pirates. And I've got with me here Heinrich as well from Important Looking Pirates. And we're going to talk a little bit about the work that we did on the episodic TV series Shogun. So there's a lot of stuff that we did do. Some of it was more or less new to us, or some things were things that we've done a lot and we're fairly confident with. And as you might have heard, on Monday morning we got the happy news that I could do a bit of a last-minute addition to this slide as well. So we're incredibly happy about this. I'm super proud of the team. Well-deserved effort for sure. And I'm just going to start off by playing our breakdown reel, and then we go over some of the stuff that we did. Thanks. So as you would have seen, there's a lot of water stuff that we are fairly known for doing. Something that we have not done a whole lot of, though, is crowds. So that is something that I'm going to cover here. So bearing that in mind, like for those of you who might have done a lot of crowds, if any of this doesn't make sense to you, that would be why. So previously, the last show that we did would have been the Far Cry 6 trailer that had any kind of crowd work worth mentioning. And we only had about 10 shots. We peaked at around 1,500 agents. We were lucky in that the style of the trailer meant that we can get away with fairly low geometric complexity. But we also had no dedicated crowd team, no crowd TDs while we worked on this. So we relied solely, more or less, on one single effects artist, kind of very quickly picking up, working with crowds, and then just kind of winging it from there. And we stuck to what we knew, which at the time was alembic caches. It kind of worked. It was fine. It was manageable, just about, I would say. So that's kind of the experience that we had going into Shogun, where we knew we would need to do a lot more. So we needed to step up our game for sure. So when we started looking into the scope of Shogun fairly early on, we knew that we would need to do entire armies marching. They needed to have very bespoke formations and regiments based on historical references, similar to what you can see in the top right corner there, and in the bottom right is also kind of us trying to replicate that. There was also very different variations of armies. We dealt with, I think, 6 or 7 different armies in some shots that needed to form up. There are a lot of accessories, different armor types, weapons, etc. And we also had a very diverse range where we would have hero characters based on mocap in shots where there'd just be 1 or 2, then scaling all the way up to, well, over 100,000 is what we heard when we started developing this, trying to figure out how to render and work with this. So some of the early things that we tried, I just put this on loop, was of course just to see how far we can get with regular Alembic caches. And as you can see here on the right, we ran an export of about 500 agents. These were full res agents, but we're still looking at about a 3-hour export, and they produced a 40 gigabyte cache. So that, of course, wasn't going to scale to the 100,000 soldiers that we needed. It's very memory hungry. And of course, we could have gotten around this with extensive LOD management. But given that we didn't really have a crowd pipeline, it's not something that we felt like we had the time or resources to develop. So we started exploring other options. Naturally, of course, we tried USD, and we got some interesting, kind of promising first results using USD scale with render time deformations. However, USD, and Solaris in particular, was not implemented at ILP at the time, so we kind of knew that it was a bit of a dead end, but it was worth trying and definitely something we would like to explore more going forward. And then the other option that we did have, given that we render through Arnold, was to render the USD procedural through the conventional object context, which is something we've done for other things. Again, we saw some promise in this, but it was still fairly memory hungry with the deformations, and we also had a lot of technical issues with motion blur and shading assignments and things like that. So that also really didn't feel like a viable option. So we started thinking about kind of things that we are more familiar with, and being a fairly effects-heavy studio. Instancing is the kind of first thing that came to mind. So there's a variety of ways you could approach this via conventional instancing. The first thing, of course, would be to just export out walk cycles. The challenges with that, of course, then would be that dealing with transitions between these different walk cycles, different actions, we wanted to have a lot of variations between the different agents, different equipments. That just meant that for every new variation of the agent that we needed, every time offset, etc., we'd start introducing new instances in memory, and then we'd start hitting the same limitations as we would have otherwise as well. And it would also be really hard for us to manage all these different cycles and keeping track of them and updating look devs, etc. So we weren't particularly keen on that. The other option as well could have been to instance entire regiments of soldiers for the really large shots, like the one you see here. That would have been very efficient, but again, very hard to address client feedback. We also, as you can see, had kind of undulating terrain, which also would have been difficult if we did these kind of flat blocks of characters. And also, at this time, we still really didn't know the full scope of the show. There's a lot of shots being added and removed, and the sequences were being cut. So we wanted to make sure that we can really be flexible and deliver the highest kind of visual fidelity at the lowest performance cost possible. So I used a kind of lifeline, call a friend, and called an old friend of mine that's a really skilled crowd TD, just talking to him for about 2 or 3 hours, I think, just getting a lot of ideas and on how to work with crowds in general. And the kind of 3 key takeaways was that deformations is always going to be slow and memory hungry, and you start getting a lot of unique memory or geometry in RAM when you have that. And similarly, he also did say that dynamic LOD switching is very difficult to hide, and something that, in his experience, they do try to avoid whenever possible. And we had a lot of shots where we would fly over the crowd as well, so we knew that we needed to do some kind of LOD switching if we went down that route. And then this last one is kind of what really kind of flicked the switch for us, and that was to, of course, avoid skinning anything that is rigid. And this makes a lot of sense, and we were already doing this to some extent. So what does that mean? We had a look at all the different pieces that we had our agents built up from. And the first kind of obvious things were, of course, all the accessories. Like, there's no point in skinning them. They're not going to be deforming. So you'd want to make sure that we instance those. Then we kind of thought that the helmets, again, like, they're of course not really deforming all that much. There'd be some minor cloth on them, but no one's really going to be able to tell. Extrapolating that onto the bodies, we got to the point where we figured that, like, armor pieces, you're really not going to see any deformation there either. Similarly, heads, hairs, etc. Like, at this scale, there's no way you're going to tell whether they are deforming or not. So we had already saved a lot of deformations from happening by doing this. And then we kind of thought, why not just go all the way? Because when you think about it, like your underarm's not necessarily deforming all that much, or like your lower leg's not deforming that much, your torso's not deforming all that much. And we thought it was kind of a fun experiment to do and just see how little deformations can we get away with, and how atrociously will this look when you start getting up close. So one of our effects TDs, Matthias Engström, set about creating this little setup that basically took the output of the crowd simulation. And here there's a loop of agent types, because initially we had several agent types, but now we baked it all into one agent. So it's actually just running this loop once. But the idea was to convert the capture attributes into point attributes, so we would know which piece of the geometry belonged to which joint. And then we split up the geometry based on that. And we move all the geometric pieces back to a kind of rest space. And then we take all the joint data coming out of the crowd simulation and create a conventional instance point cloud with orient and scale and things like that. So we kind of end up with these, what we refer to as sausage pieces for the agents. And the output result was about 400 unique pieces for all of our agents. And we also did some removing of excessive bones. Like the first iteration that we did, we had all the joints for the hands, for example. So we ended up with a lot of small pieces for the hands, which was pointless. So some further optimization there, like reduce the number of pieces further. So now that we have this, we figured, oh yeah, so here's a slide of all the different pieces that we ended up with, just to give you a rough idea of what it looked like. So by themselves, they're not particularly impressive. Yeah, so this is kind of one of the first early tests we did just to see what happens. So we ran 300,000 agents. We ended up with, yeah, as you can see, like 57 million points. And the whole thing was a 15 megabyte cache per frame. This was fairly expensive to both export and render still, like approaching kind of 80 gigabytes of RAM, which would have been acceptable, but not ideal. And yeah, here's just a little zoom in to the corner just to give you an idea of like how stupid this was. And it also informed us what about 100,000 agents meant visually, and we kind of knew then that we never really need that. And at that point, it just looks like render noise anyways. So we did some further optimizations. So here's a 10,000 agent one where we removed a lot of the pieces that we didn't need and also reduced the number of joints. So now we were down to 2.3 megabyte render, or 2.3 gigabyte render, and we had about 100 pieces per agent. So then seeing this, we knew that, okay, we can do this at scale. That really shouldn't be a problem. But of course, like, it got us curious. What does this look like close up? So this is the output of these instance crowds. So there's absolutely no deformations going on here, except for the flags that were exported as conventional alembics. But we did realize that this actually holds up significantly closer than we thought it would. And I think this test render here is a fairly good kind of indication of where we drew the line between foreground, like full alembic deforming caches and these kind of background characters. Let's see if I can skip to the next one. Yeah, so here's one of the later shots in the sequence that we were initially really concerned about, because this we knew would be in that kind of 100,000 plus mark. It's a bit hard to see in this one, but you've got 5 or 6 armies there in the background, and it's one of those shots that, like now towards the end of the show, it just happened, and we didn't really reflect much on it, which was a huge relief, and again, like something that had us quite concerned at the start of the show. And here's another shot that we used as an early kind of development shot, which kind of highlights a lot of the challenges that we did have. Sorry about the playback, but where we had very bespoke formations that we needed to account for. It's not very visible here, but they were all formed by different equipment, weapons. They had kind of lords on horses that we needed to fan out in terms of like the different ranks were forming out based on distance from those. And this is also would have been one of those dynamic LOD shots. And what was really nice about this one as well was that we tried to embrace our lighters. Like, they're really more like generalists. So the guy who was working on this, he was modifying the terrain even after the crowd caches had been exported. And I'm going to show you how we did that just after this. As for the kind of full setup, there really wasn't much to it other than this. So we would have our crowd agents coming out of the DOP simulation, and then we ran this through the Samurai Slicer HDA, which is the one that I showed you earlier, and that would output a kind of copy to points viewport proxy, which also was incredibly performant and meant that we could view almost the entire army just in the viewport, or you could very easily just cull points to see a small representation of the agents in the viewport. We also then output an alembic sequence of the sausage pieces and per joint sausage piece point cloud. So we needed to have 1 point per unique geometry affected by each joint. So it did mean that, like a shoulder, for example, we might have 3 or 4 points, one for the armor, one for the kind of like the torso or the skin underneath, etc. So I think we were about like 70 to 100 points maybe tops per agent. And then we had to export all these Alembic files as ASS files so that we can reference them using the instance file attribute, because you couldn't do that with Arnold directly to the Alembic files on disk. And then on the far right, we had our kind of LookDev hero asset that contained all the shading attributes and all the rendering parameters. And they were just simply attribute copied onto the instance points that were then kind of inherited by the render geometry. So that meant that we could very easily do variations and shading overrides on the agents on a per point level. So this was incredibly useful when we had the multiple armies to deal with, or if we just wanted to control the subdivision levels based on distance and things like that. So incredibly, like kind of all of the usual benefits you would have while working through instancing, but applied to crowds. And then the ASS file sequence and the point cloud that then contained all the render attributes were just merged together in a conventional Houdini instancer. So it's a fairly simple but elegant solution, I think, to this that served us very well. So some of the obvious benefits were that we had insanely fast time to first pixel. It was really just usually a few seconds, if that, to get a decent result seen in your viewport or in your IPR render. The I/O, of course, was incredibly small as well. Like usually our crowd caches would only be a few megabytes per frame. And the memory management as well was kind of silly low for the visual complexity that we had, because we only needed to keep track of one instance per unique geometry. So it was incredibly memory efficient. But also we got a lot of visual fidelity out of it as well, because all of the agents were completely unique. So the kind of outfit that they were wearing, the behavior, like all of their motion, there was no kind of compromising on what came out of the DOP simulation and the equipment that we equipped each of the agents with. And we kind of skipped LOD management altogether. So every single agent that we rendered was the full high-res geometry with the full high-res shading as well. Because if we were to introduce a LOD level, we would actually effectively increase the memory management. So we figured we'd just run full res for every agent. And then also, like lastly, we did have really nice ways of controlling this. So we could cull stuff. We could do similar to what I mentioned earlier. We could adjust the terrain, and then we could have the delta between the two offset the points. So our lighters could then adjust the terrain without us having to go back to effects and crowd to re-export any of this. And again, we could do point overrides for shading variations and things like that. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Heinrich, who's going to talk a little bit about how we approach the landslide sequence.
Okay. Thank you, Timmy. Thank you. Hello, my name is Heinrich Löwe, and I'm working for Important Looking Pirates as CGTD. And I was deeply involved in creating the landslide effects for the Shogun show. And I'm going to talk about trees today. So I'm gonna motivate this with a video because why I want to talk about trees. So this is a QC render I did when the effect was like not finished, but we were at the point where we wanted it to push down the pipeline for the lighters to make it pretty. And why I want to talk about trees here is like, first, trees are fun. So I like to do trees. I like to do vegetation in general. And the second point is that if you look at the start of the simulation, trees are taking like a huge chunk of pixel real estate on the screen. So a lot of pixels are directly influenced by trees. So it made sense to put a lot of effort into trees. But how do we approach a simulation like this, and how do we start? And for this, I'm going to take a step back. Stop, please. And we look at a single tree. So this is one of the foreground trees we had. And on the left-hand side, like over here, this is the render mesh. It's like polygons and points and like attributes. And on the other hand is like the skeleton or spine equivalent geometry, which we used for simulations. And this tree alone, it had like 3 million polygons, like 4,000 parts, and like a 4-level hierarchy. And with hierarchy, I mean, it's like divided into trunk, branches, twigs, and needles. And I took this tree to do some initial tests. And I show you a video I did when this first step worked. And you see, it kind of does what it should do. So it moves fairly naturally, it collides with itself, but it also showed us that there's one fundamental problem with this thing. And those are 10 trees. And I said there are 3 million polygons for one, and 10, this is 30 million polygons. And we don't want to do 10 trees, we want to do 10,000 trees. So this will be, you won't be able to fit this much memory into any machine, or this much data into any machine's memory. So how do we tackle this? And for this, we look at another tree. So it is this similar thing. So we have, well, I switched it. Okay, the render mesh to the right and the curves to the left. And these are the background trees we saw in the main simulation, and there are like 12 variations for them, and they all have 1 to 2 million polygons per tree. And on the whole terrain, so when our layout artist created the hill or the mountain, which was supposed to slide down, it consisted of like 625,000 trees. And well, we didn't simulate them all. We split it into 3 separate regions. And then we simulated like those, like up to 5 to up to 10,000 trees. And I did some ballpark math here. So if you would render naively without instancing all those trees, you would end up with 1.2 trillion polygons. It's not million, not billion, it's trillion. And well, even the simulated trees is like 20 billion polygons. And this is never going to work. And so we had to come up with something more clever. We look at the same tree here. And what we would do here is to look at the hierarchy I've mentioned before. So the hierarchy is a string attribute, and it divides the tree in all its parts. And you see on the lower right here, this is like a parameter expression. And you can see, okay, add hierarchy equals trunk star, and so you get the whole tree. But you could also look at a single branch. You could say, okay, trunk, branch, main, some number, star. So you get not the whole tree, but just the branch and all its children. And you could go even deeper. So you take a sub-branch. And now you see the hierarchy expression is it gets longer, but you still can pick individual parts up to twig level. So we didn't bother with simulating needles, because needles, it's too far. You won't see any change in that. But what can we do with this string hierarchy attribute? Well, we used it for shading, so you can pick, let's say, all the needles, or all the branches, or all the wood parts, and you can assign like shading parameters to it. Or you use it for simulations, because the hierarchy attribute is on both. It's on the render mesh and it's on the curve mesh as well. And you can assign like stiffness and, well, constraints and whatever simulation parameters you want to supply. But the most important thing is you can also use it for cutting off individual parts and use them for instance those parts. And how we did this, I'm gonna look at even another tree. So this is one of those 12 variation trees. And it's a little bit simpler in topology. So it has no like sub-branches. It had like just a trunk, a branch, and then needles and twigs. And what we did here is we cut off all the branches. And then, so those are all the branches which were related to the tree before. And they are here displayed in a grid for better overview. And then we sorted them by size. And then we transformed them into the individual branch space. And we've talked about like PCA yesterday. This is another application for it. And now we have like ordered, like to the origin transformed branches in unity scale. And we can cluster them by size. So we have 6 clusters in this case, and they all like represent different sizes. And then we pick 2, maybe 1, maybe 3, depending on the tree, branches from those clusters. And now we have 12 branches. We pack them up. And if you look at the original tree here, we replace the original branches with instance branches. And this has 2 major advantages. The first one is it's very simple to simulate. So you don't have like hundreds of curves with sub-hierarchies and sub-curves attached, but just 2-point curves. And they can rotate, they can't bend anymore. But they can rotate, they can collide, and usually this holds up for mid to background trees. And the other benefit of this is at each root point or anchor point of those branches, we can put just a single instance branch, and it's basically just a point and a transfer matrix you send to the renderer, so it turns out to be very efficient. And if I shuffle back and forth here, and you look at the left-hand side, so the tree obviously changes, but it doesn't change in look and feel. And this was sufficient for all the things which happened in mid and background. So there's another video, and this shows one of the regions, and this is the simulation geometry, which we use to drive the render geometry at the end. And you see the green bluish parts in the background. These are the low resolution trees, which just had like replaced branches. And then the reddish part in the foreground, those are more high-res trees, and they had replaced sub-hierarchies at twig level. So we were able to do some, in this case, manual LODing, but it worked out really great. So, did this stop? Yes. Okay, so let me give you some key facts about the simulation we did. And this is region A, so we split the whole terrain into 3 chunks. And region A had we simulated 400 frames with 50 frames pre-roll. And then we distributed this long simulation into individual shots. And for this, we created like a handover workflow. So we wrapped up all the caches, all the things related, the RBD, the dust, the trees, the scatter, whatever we threw on it, and condensed it in a single BGEO file, and this was given to the lighters. And they had an import HDA where they put in just this one file, and it extracted and built the scene for them. this is, I think, something you might get free when using USD, but we were not ready at this point. So this one had 5K trees, and it had like 130,000 deformed parts. Deformed parts are trunks and branches which are not instanced. And then 1.6 million instances, which were those branches and twigs we replaced in the original models. There were two options to solve this. We first started to, well, for me it was like the obvious thing to look into was the wire solver, because it does exactly that, simulating curves. And it's stable and it's easy to set up, but Vellum turned out to be more versatile. You can go wild with constraints and like integration into other parts of the simulation. So we ended up using Vellum at the end. Those are some ballpark numbers. It's like simulation time, 15 hours. Obviously, this depends on like the machines which were picking up the jobs. But the main point here is it's an overnight job. So you send it, I don't know, and you go home and next day you hope it's done. Memory consumption, 60 gigabyte at peak, and this is the deformable parts. And I can show you, those are deformable parts here. And this is, as I said, the bottleneck, because this was very heavy geometry. And you see here in the background, it's just trunks without the instance branches. And in the foreground, the reddish thing, it's trunks and branches without twigs and needles, because the twigs and needles were deformable parts at this time. This all was driven by a fairly large RBD sim with like 700K pieces, 10 million polygons. And what we did here, because colliding 10 million polygons with like huge amounts of curves is very expensive. So we boiled it down to like a collision, low-res VDB collision volume, and a super low-res velocity carrier volume. And how this works is the Vellum algorithm, as I understand it, like traces the collision against the VDB, and then it looks up into the velocity mesh, or into the mesh, and picks the velocity for that intersection. And this turned out to be really, really efficient. And this low-res mesh, it looks like shit. It's like no consistent topology, polygons flipping all over the place, holes inside, but it's just used for picking the velocity. And yeah, and all the other pieces like the scatter geometry and the rocks and snow and small plant, this was all non-simulated, but just driven by the underlying RBD sim. So what can we do with this? So we obviously can do landslides, but we can also do like weather effects, like global weather effects, where you don't have just swaying trees, but you can blow gusts through trees and like break trees eventually, and use this for all kinds of like tree destruction and simulation. And we're currently in the progress in generalizing this and porting it to USD and making it available not just for trees, but for arbitrary plants like, I don't know, grass and bushes and trees, obviously. And we try to use the Scale API for this, for these deformable parts, and this solves the big bottleneck, because you don't deform each thing and store it every frame, but you say deform this with this skeleton, and it's done more or less automatically. And obviously you can use the point instance for leaves and fruits and sub-hierarchies and such. And yeah, that's coming to an end. So this is one video I did when this thing was working, and this was a happy day. And I called this like torturing the trees. And it shows to an extent of what this whole setup is capable of. And yeah, it looks great. I like the ball like on the left, like coming through here, and all those, like this was 10,000 trees, and you see problems here because the colliding geometry, the Vellum curves, they start to intersect and entangle, and they don't step up like they should do, but this is something you would expect in such scenario. So I think, stop. That's it from me. Thank you very much. And we're open for questions.
Thank you.
Any questions? Ooh.
Hi. So I wanted to ask what kind of workflow you used to apply the vellum sim to the mesh. So basically, did you just use point deform or?
No. We tried the point deform, but if you use like curves to deform mesh, you don't get the orientation for free. So it's kind of random how the deformed mesh like is oriented. And what we did, we created our own, not point deformer, but curve deformer, which is somehow missing in Houdini, I think. And it takes into account the orientation of each curve, and then not just moves the position of the driven mesh, but also like rotates it according to the orientation of the curve.
So you just use some like orient attributes or matrices to?
Well, in this case, we use the orient attribute, but it could obviously use the transform attribute, and in USD and USD scale, you provide like bone curves and they use transform attributes. So it's
cool.
Can be done in both ways.
And how many levels of hierarchy? What was your max levels of hierarchy per tree?
I think it was 5. So we had like trunks and branches and sub-branches and twigs and needles. So it was 5, of course, yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Super cool. What do you think about the approach that the USD crowd procedural in Solaris uses? And if you guys move over to that, do you think that you will look into that at all in terms of the like switching the instances based on like similar poses between different agents and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, when we tried it last, it was at the start of the show, so that would have been kind of early mid last year. So a lot has probably happened since. But my understanding, like with USD scale, you're still looking at deforming the geometry. So you would still have a lot of unique memory. So even though it does happen at render time, it'll be really quick, the deformation itself. You're not, to my understanding, saving all that much as far as memory goes. So I'm not actually sure like how beneficial it would be from a memory standpoint. And
right.
You probably still need to rely on LODs or some kind of instancing workflow.
Yeah, I think the idea is that it is instancing them based on how similar the different poses are between the different characters and stuff. So there is some memory gains there, but like you might get some artifacts or something if you push it too hard. Yeah, I really like the approach with the chopping it up into sausages and stuff. That seems like that works really well, especially when they have armor and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing that we didn't actually do that we kind of knew or thought that we knew that we would need to do initially would actually be to kind of close off those sausages. So you'd have kind of intersecting geometry where you've got elbows, knees, and stuff like that. We kind of got away without doing that. So it's just open geometry, and like with some shading tricks, you don't really see it all that much. But if we were to do this again, we'd probably do that from the get-go, and then we could probably get closer as well.
It's super cool. Thanks.
I can add something to this. What would be beneficial if you use instancing and point instancing, the instancing methods for USD, you would get rid of all the fuck up you had to do with like a lambing and asphalt instancing and like copying data back and forth and like assigning paths. This you more or less get for free, which would be a big benefit.
Right. Thank you.
Super cool work, guys. Back to the trees. So for the RBD simulation part, did you have your trees pre-fractured and then had some constraints on them, or they were just like full pieces and never broke, or how did that work?
Yeah, that was actually a fairly complicated sim and would be like a topic of its own. But we did like a multi-stage fracturing and then had like big chunks, and these big chunks were like broken into smaller chunks, and the combining regions between two chunks were fractured in a different way. And then we had a lot of constraints between them, and we also had those, I forgot what it was called. We have this fake soft body approach for RBD simulation, where we remesh the thing and it deforms a little bit like mushy. We used this as well, and a lot of breaking constraints. And yeah, this was fairly complicated.
And then vellum on top of that for smaller details, or?
Yes, we had particles on top of this, and on top of the thing also like the trees. And for the foreground simulation, we not just had particles, but also vellum particles for like ground or earth effects. And yes.
So cool. Thank you.
That's it? Yes? Okay, thank you, Heinrich and Timmy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.